I was basically told you can do a FaceTime with Dad before he goes into ICU and say goodbye in the instance that he doesn't make it through. You're just thrown into this whirlpool of time-sensitive form filling and phone calls, and really that's the last thing that you want to have to do when you've just lost a parent. The inability for us to be able to process our loss is inhumane. It really hits home when the funeral director delivers the death certificate, and maybe it'll get given a list of organisations to notify. I must say that I've never had anyone walk away with the list and say, thanks, I'll do it myself. It's, oh my goodness, I had no idea there was all of this stuff to do. Please help me.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today we're speaking with Danielle Phillips, an only child and the founder of Sage Executor Solutions. Danielle realised the importance of an executor when she lost both of her parents at the age of 35 during the COVID-19 pandemic. Danielle then decided to found Sage Executor Solutions that provides support to a deceased person's family and the executor of the will. Thank you so much for being with us today, Danielle.
Thanks, Catherine. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell me about that time and those challenges that you went through. In the middle of COVID, you lost both your parents.
Yes, it was extremely traumatic, you might say. And I just remember at the time when the pandemic was announced, looking at, seeing on the TV, there were nursing homes that were, going into lockdown and families that couldn't go in and see grandparents. And I just thought, imagine being one of those people that were told you can't go and see a family member or someone that was ill or someone that was sick because of the pandemic. And I just felt so awful for those people. And within a month of that, I found myself pretty much in the same position. I did get a call from my dad, who was taken to emergency after having some chest issues for a couple of months, and doctors couldn't quite work out what was happening. And so I got the call. He'd gone into emergency. So I jumped on a flight, got there within the day, and called the emergency department to speak to the doctor and said, I'm on my way on the train, on the way to the hospital, where do I meet you? And of course the response was, no, you can't come in. The hospital's in lockdown because of COVID. And they'd done a couple of scans at the hospital and found there was quite a large shadow across Dad's lungs. And the only option was to intubate, so he could either try and recover in the instance that it was an infection or a pneumonia, and they had to biopsy to see whether it was potentially also a cancer. So I was basically told you can do a FaceTime with Dad before he goes into ICU and say goodbye in the instance that he doesn't make it through. And my mum at this time had been diagnosed with a very rare neurological disorder called corticobasal degeneration. And Dad was her full-time carer. So she was cognitively completely 100% there, but there's a protein that overgrows in the brain and stops the signals going to the muscles. So she was very limited in her mobility. So therefore Dad had to be her full-time carer. So Mum and I basically at the family home had to get on a FaceTime call and say goodbye to Dad in the instance he didn't recover. And within 3 days after the biopsy, they realised it was a very aggressive cancer, and we were allowed into the ICU to make the decision to turn off the ventilator. So it all happened extremely quickly in some of the most traumatic times. And I guess, then I realised this is more than just about grief and loss of a parent. This is now me having to step in as Dad's executor with very little help from Mum because of her capacity issues, whilst we were in a lockdown and Mum needed full-time care. So fast forward 15 months down the track, I did bring Mum back to South Australia where I live and got her into a wonderful nursing home at Helping Hand in North Adelaide, and Mum did decline and eventually did pass away in a nursing home. So I was then back in the position of a mum, and realised there was just very limited space and capacity for an executor who is the next of kin and family member to be able to grieve. You're just thrown into this whirlpool of time-sensitive form filling and phone calls, and really that's the last thing that you want to have to do when you've just lost a parent, a sister, a brother, a partner, or a child. So I thought it was pretty inhumane, and there was really no organisation or support network that I could delegate anything to give myself that space and capacity. So hence Sage Executor Solutions was born, because I'm really here to step in and mobilise for families when they find themselves in the position of executor of the will or next of kin, and they really just don't want to have to do all of the administration.
And what are some of the things that you found sort of the most challenging to do in that time? Like, you mentioned that you put your own life on hold, moved when you got the call from the doctor about your father, and then you then had to step in as carer as well. Like,
Yeah.
that's a lot to have to deal with.
It was a lot to navigate, and really during that 15 months after Dad passed, priority was really mum and mum's care and getting her close to me. And with South Australia, fortunately, our borders were closed, which meant that nursing homes remained open to visitors. So I was able to bring mum home every day and spend quality time with her. So that was the real focus. But what I found really the most time consuming was actually navigating my way through the list of organizations to notify and accounts to close, and even just procuring the right documentation for that, because I don't know if anyone on the call's been on the MyGov website, but there's links within links and pages within pages, and when you're dealing with grief, to have to try and comprehend all of that paperwork is pretty overwhelming. So I actually found that just the sourcing of documentation took up most of my time, and statistically it takes 200 to 300 hours for an executor to administer an estate. And I'm not surprised having done it myself, because there's not really a clear roadmap. There's no chronological order in which you're kind of advised to do it. So these things can absolutely blow out for months and up to a year. And I actually was fortunate enough to take time off work, and I don't have any children or dependents, and it still took me 12 months. So how families with dependents and career and travel and responsibilities are doing this is beyond me. And I really feel for them to be in that position, because it almost becomes a full-time job.
Yeah, and look, that was totally my experience as well when our friend died. And just that added layer of, his children were American, so they didn't even understand the system in Australia, let alone what was the first step. And as you clearly said, there is no real guide, at that time that could take us through those steps that were required. And that was challenging. And also, there's just so many assumptions that I found that when you ring these services, that they assume, well, firstly, it'd be a lot challenging for Sophia if I hadn't been the one making the phone calls, because they would sometimes, argue with me about whether that person was deceased or not. And I'm like, no, I can assure you they are. And I'm like, I can't believe that that's what they say to someone who's ringing up to notify you that they're dead, and you can't speak to them on the phone because that's impossible.
Yeah, it's they're almost not listening. It's just a robotic spiel that they need to go through. So when you're trying to manage this role of transactional responsibility, but be, in a space of really just needing compassion, that gap can be quite wide. And I found the same when Dad passed, and Mum, of course, was Dad's executor. I was Mum's power of attorney. But because of Mum's neurological disorder, she couldn't speak well. She had a lot of speaking difficulties, and they would constantly say to me, we need to speak to the executor. And I would try and get them to understand Mum doesn't have capacity to speak. So you feel like you're hitting a brick wall a lot of the time. So yeah, it's emotionally very challenging.
Wow, that is such an extra layer that you had to deal with. It'd be interesting whether you had a similar experience, is that you're talking to people sometimes that don't understand what the appropriate legal documents are either. So, in that situation that you were just talking through, we know that an executor is related to a will, and that happens and becomes effective after death, whereas a power of attorney is something that is pre-death and you can represent that person. So, to you and I, who have a little bit of experience in this space, you can know that you were in the right areas to be talking and you had the appropriate permissions. But a lot of people don't even have that knowledge.
No, that's right. And if they've not been through what we've been through, the penny hasn't really dropped for them, I don't think.
And then the added complication with the fact that you, Danielle, are in South Australia and I am in Victoria. And so our laws are different, aren't they?
And Mum and Dad's estate was pretty much in New South Wales and I'm in SA. So you can imagine how many trips back and forward once the borders were open that I had to make to deal with property related matters. Fortunately, COVID has evolved a lot in terms of the way we deal with probate applications to the court, and we can maybe touch on what that probate is a little bit later. But prior to COVID, there was no video calls with lawyers. So certain states now at least have, I guess, been able to offer people such as myself the ability to witness and certify documentation for a probate application when perhaps the executor isn't living in the estate of the deceased estate. So, yeah.
One of the good things to come out of COVID.
One of the good things.
Now tell us, at what point did the penny drop for you that you thought, I think I'm going to turn this into a business?
So for me, it was after the 12 months of being knee deep in paperwork and realising that my time would have been so much better used if I was able to engage in some grief counselling or healing or being able to actually just settle into the reality of what had happened, because really that ability to process things isn't afforded to you because the priority becomes administration. So I think from a human perspective, the inability for us to be able to process our loss is inhumane. And so I just thought, if I could have delegated this or some of this or handballed it, I would have been much better off mentally and emotionally and physically, because as we know, physical ailments can often arise from emotional and mental stress and trauma. So, a lot of physical ailments came up for me. And that's when I thought, this has inspired me to be someone that's gone through the process, that's walked the walk, that has learnt some of the best ways to work through the process in a chronological order. I built my own road through the process. I came up with an inventory of about 40 different tasks that I had to address. And when I first embarked on the process, I would have thought maybe there were 5 or 10 things I needed to do. But as you know, once you start the process, it's like opening Pandora's box. You notify one department and all of a sudden that means that, 2 other or 3 other organisations attached to that need to be notified. And there's just, so many little tips and tricks along the way that I learned that I just wanted to pay forward that information to try and lighten the load for people, particularly the executors and next of kin, where there never has been a choice or a luxury to decide, do I have the capacity right now to be on the phone to Telstra or Centrelink and potentially on the phone to someone that doesn't really empathise with my situation? So that was my inspiration.
And you talk about the skills required. What do you think are the skills? Because I think that sometimes when we agree to be someone's executor, if we do have a will, and that's if we do have a will, because we know that, it's only roughly half the population or a little less than half the population that has written a will. So what are the skills? You sign the will and you sign as an executor, but what really are you actually signing up for? Because I don't think that until we'd really gone through it with Roland that I'd really comprehended just how much is involved if it's not documented. Because for me personally, my father was a clerk of the coroner's court, so we've always had wills and documentation and things like that. I just thought that was normal until I met my husband and realised that it's so not normal. And so, I thought I knew to a degree how much it involved, but it was those like pesky letters that turn up 8 months later when you think you got everything covered, that you just go, I didn't think about that, getting the annual eye test or something,
Yeah.
Really, really just mundane like that.
Just triggering, you think you've started to reach the light at the end of the tunnel. My aha moment was the electoral roll. So there was a New South Wales election, and I was so fortunate as to receive a fine because Mum hadn't voted. And my assumption would be that one of the government departments would have talked to the Electoral Commission, but that's not the case. So it was, 12 months later, and I thought, great, I've tied everything up. And then I was receiving something from the Electoral Commission. So, yes, hence the list of 40 different items and things that people don't even think about. It's things like if you've got a property that's now vacant, notifying the home insurer, because if there's an incident at the property, such as a theft, a break-in, fire or flood, and the insurer isn't notified that it's now a deceased estate and that, the insurance policy isn't put into the name of the executor, they could very easily deny a claim. So it's all those little things that you just don't think about that can come back to bite you in the future.
That is so true, isn't it? And what sort of skills do you think make a good executor? So before we sign on that dotted line,
Yep.
And we've been asked by someone to be an executor, what should we really consider what that means?
Well, capacity for me means a lot of things. It's about, do I have time capacity? What are my commitments and priorities and responsibilities? Do I have other dependents that I'm caring for? What are my work commitments? What are my travel commitments? The other thing that a lot of people overlook, and something that's coming across my desk quite often, are people that have been nominated and appointed as an executor that are elderly. So these people may not have access to the internet, email, they may not be tech savvy. And then there's mobility issues, because sometimes you need to go into a services SA location to present documentation. But if you're an elderly person and you don't have mobility and you don't have transport, that might make things quite difficult for you. So I always think about time capacity, technical capacity, and mobility capacity. And I suppose even just, how would you honestly rate your administration skills? Reading, comprehending, just general literacy. There's tax and accounting considerations. There's, such a big responsibility in terms of having to settle liabilities. So how comfortable are you with paying bills, settling invoices, making phone calls? Emotionally, where are you at in your life? Have you just recently dealt with a loss or grief of your own? Because this could actually be quite emotionally taxing if you yourself going through loss and a healing process. So I hope that gives a little bit of idea of just some of the considerations, because it is more of a commitment than a lot of people think. And as I said, statistically, it can take up to 300 hours, can feel like a part-time to full-time job. And there's really no harm in having a good think about it before you commit to sign in the dotted line. There is a small saving grace that if you do find yourself appointed executor, because some people aren't even told, they find out by chance, surprise, you can renounce that responsibility. It would need to be formally done with a legal practitioner. But if you do find yourself in that position unknowingly and unwillingly, you can renounce.
And certainly if your circumstances have changed too from, sometimes people write their wills and never look at them again and think, oh, well, that's that done. But we know that life is forever changing and, it's something that probably should be kept up to date. And yeah, so if you do find yourself that you can no longer commit, that they can also,
Renounce
opt out,
that.
can't they? Yeah.
Yep.
I'm intrigued to who uses your services. Like, what sort of people are you seeing a trend in particular type of people that use it, or?
Actually, there's no real trend because, as we know, death and loss touches everyone. I mean, for me, I was 35, and then I've got clients that are in their 40s and 50s that have lost a partner, and then I've also got sort of that older generation that are losing parents. So as we know, we're all living longer. So for me, there's no real trend or pattern. It's something that everyone and anyone could potentially benefit from. Where I would say that my services would be really beneficial, again, it comes back to people without that capacity. So, really busy mums and dads, the sandwich generation, mums and dads that have been caring for their own children and then caring for their parents tend to be the most time poor and time pressed we see. So, lightening that load so that they can continue to keep the wheels spinning on their life without having to be pulled in yet another direction, for me, is where I see a lot of the benefit, because you've still got to maintain your own household and those responsibilities. So, people are working longer and longer hours. So to then be told, hey, you've now got 200 hours worth of extra admin that you're not getting paid for, that's also very emotionally taxing. That to me sort of seems even more unachievable for people in that kind of age bracket. But then again, I do have some elderly clients which do experience a bit of, I guess they're not as technically savvy. And also with that generation, it was really one or the other that looked after the accounts, the finances, and the home admin.
Yeah, yeah,
And then that partner who was doing it all passes away. The surviving spouse all of a sudden has to start learning a bunch of new skills that they've never had to do before. And in that regard, it's really overwhelming. So I'd say probably the sandwich generation and then the elderly generation are probably, if I had to pick a trend or a couple of trends, that's where I'd go.
And when you say, that extra 200 hours on top of whatever else you're doing and the life that you're living at that point in time, most of this has to be done within business hours too, doesn't it?
It does have to be done within business hours. And some of these forms need to be filled out and sent within 28 days, particularly, government Centrelink pension related forms, so that there aren't overpayments happening, because then we have to pay that back. And so there's, lots of things that you only have a month to action. And some people don't even have the death certificate then. I've got a client at the moment that's just waited 11 weeks for a death certificate. So it's, very interesting, because you've got a 28-day period to do certain things, and then you're waiting for the death certificate in the meantime. And then when that comes, it's sort of like, where do I go next and what do I do next? And so I suppose what I have established and understood through my own experience and now through the Sage business is, if you've got a really good roadmap or a checklist, something that's been in play and pre-planned, and I guess exactly what you're aiming to achieve, Catherine, with your checklist is, how can we remove a lot of that workload by planning better for it? It doesn't have to take 300 hours or 12 months. My average client case at the moment is being wrapped up within 3 months. So that's, 9 months of someone's life that they
Yeah.
potentially get back to focus and invest more on their grief and their healing, and just being able to have a cup of tea with family and look through photos, not be on the phone to Telstra and Centrelink. So again, there's, preparing and planning that can be so helpful to reduce and eliminate a lot of that workload.
And what would you say,
Yeah.
Danielle, are those things that people can do beforehand, before, we get to the sticky situation where it's a life-limiting illness that they get diagnosed with, or because that has so much stress and emotion attached with it? What are some of the things that we can do that make it a little bit easier?
So making sure that you've got your hands on original documents like birth certificates, marriage certificates, things like that will always be needed with superannuation claims, and certainly with probate applications for when we need to apply to the court to have the will validated before the executor can even act. So just having original documents on hand, because having that conversation with a loved one before they pass away is a whole lot easier than having to try and turn the house upside down to find those documents, or having to apply to births, deaths and marriages for, copies of those. So, I think just those really simple things, having as an executor your eyes across what bank accounts exist, who your loved one has their insurance policies with, having the account numbers handy, who are their utility providers. So really just gathering everything that you could potentially need to have to address or notify in advance, having it in a little folder. Obviously, Catherine, your checklist is gold because you itemize all of that from A to Z, and it's nitty gritty. So there's really nothing that can be missed, because really having to try and find all of that documentation and locate which banks and accounts and passwords and email addresses exist once someone's passed away, it's just adding another layer to the already difficult time that you're experiencing.
And, we haven't even discussed the funeral.
No. Nope.
So this is all in addition to organising a funeral, whether that's something you want to be actively involved in, or that's something that you get support from a funeral director, etc. So there's so much, isn't there?
And I think people's first thoughts naturally go to the funeral, which is generally, the priority. That's natural. But then where it really hits home is when the funeral director delivers the death certificate to you and all the ashes. You realize, okay, I've got this death certificate. Now what do I do? And maybe, as I said, you'll get given a list of organisations to notify. But for me, it was basically just a piece of paper with a whole long list of things that I had to do, but I didn't want to do them because I was trying to care for my mum full time and navigate COVID, and I was trying to grieve. So whilst the list of organisations to notify is somewhat helpful, it's just another piece of paper, and it often doesn't have the phone numbers or the websites or where on the website to navigate to. So you sort of, running blind through the process. And I honestly believe that's why it's taking people hundreds of hours, because there's no clear roadmap.
And I think it's also that added pressure that we had, and you may have had something similar when your father died, that, when Roland died, he was living in a rental apartment in St Kilda Road. And so we had to be really mindful of the time, because each day, each week, it was actually effectively costing the family money to pay rent for his belongings still in the apartment. And so that was just another thing to navigate. And so do you work with other organisations? So you specifically look at the administration side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you tap into other organisations? Like, I know for us, we ended up we contacted 3 auction houses to come and give us a quote on clearing all of the contents that wasn't wanted by family and friends. Do you work with other organisations like that, Danielle?
Yeah, so part of my service offering is to connect families with very carefully curated professionals and experts in various industries. So I've been working to build a network of professionals that I've either worked with and used myself or have a close affiliation with, so that I can hand on heart make that referral, because that's another thing that took up so much of my time. It was the researching who to use for property, conveyancing, probate, financial planning, accounting, grief counselling matters. All of that takes time. So for me, this network that I've built is at a national level. It then stems down state by state, city by city, and it's even starting to grow now, township by township, suburb by suburb, because people, we can be parochial. And also, if there are mobility issues, I always like to try and connect my clients with someone located geographically in proximity, because a lot of the professionals that I refer will actually come to the home of the person that's lost a loved one, because it can be quite difficult for people with mobility issues to get to those support services. So I've done all the groundwork to be able to refer with confidence to declutterers and, as I said, property experts and conveyancers. And I'm sort of liaising with those experts and my client throughout the process, because I still want it to feel like I'm that main person that they're dealing with, because I think the least people that you can deal with in a time of grief is helpful. So I still remain that sort of one point of contact, middleman, advocate for my clients, but they can rest assured that who I've sort of connected them with and partnered them with will advocate for them too.
And that's how we met, wasn't it? We are
Yes.
both affiliate members of the Australian Funeral Directors Association, and I think I've spoken here on the podcast previously about the fact that I've joined numerous industry associations to ensure that when we also refer, you're referring to someone who can you be found in the local area, but is a member of an industry association, so you get that sort of quality assurance from that membership. So that's how we met.
And we live by a code of ethics, and it's very well governed, and you're not accepted into that membership lightly. So yeah.
Danielle, you mentioned that you're across Australia and you go down to an even very local level in regional areas. So how does that work? It's a referral system that you were saying?
Yeah, so I mean, people will tend to find me through, I guess, a funeral director that they've been liaising with. Sometimes people will be speaking with a probate lawyer, and the probate lawyers will be able to make the applications to the courts for them, but may not actually then want to take on all of that sort of lower level form filling, phone call making, notification process. So I'll often receive a lot of inquiries there. But I suppose from wherever you're coming from, I offer a 1 hour complimentary consultation. And in that consultation, we go through the list of 40 different items that could need to be addressed. And then we tailor and customize what that plan would look like for an executor or family member. And from there, really, the beauty of that is that a family member or executor can see what the commitment actually looks like for them. And some families may only need to tackle 5 things on that list for a very simple estate. Some may not need probate. They may not be a superannuation claim. But then some families may need to touch on all 40 items. So, yeah, that consultation is just so helpful in terms of being able to shine a light on what the commitment looks like. And again, it comes back to capacity, giving an executor a choice as to how much of this do I want to take on, or can I engage with Danny to share the load or take it on for me. And so then at a national level, we're able to identify, if you do need probate, great, which state are you based in? Because every state is mandated differently, conveyancing's done differently, and it's really about connecting people appropriately with the expertise and services that they would benefit from. So really, after the consultation, there's no obligation to engage with me. I must say that I've never had anyone walk away with the list and say, thanks, I'll do it myself. It's, oh my goodness, I had no idea there was all of this stuff to do, please help me. But it really is just about education and giving people the opportunity to understand, once I'm in knee deep, it can be really hard to navigate to the end. And do I have 12 months to do this because I've never done it before and I don't really know the path of least resistance? So yeah, the consultation's really helpful in that regard.
And it must be also really helpful for people to understand what you can assist them with and then what they will need to get legal advice for, or they'll need to get an accountant for, or a
Yes,
financial advisor, or whatever. Because if you
absolutely.
go the flip side and you go to a lawyer first, it's going to be a lot more expensive, isn't it?
It can be. And I think that there's a lot of considerations financially that people don't necessarily realize. And that's, for example, a superannuation death claim. So if you are currently receiving a pension or a Centrelink entitlement, and there's a $300,000 superannuation benefit payable to you because you are the nominated beneficiary, do you understand that there could be implications around your Centrelink entitlements? Because as we know, there's means tested entitlements dependent on your income and assets. So if you all of a sudden end up with $300,000 extra in your bank account, you might find next month your entitlement isn't paid to you. And that's really hard to undo and unwind. So, connecting you with a professional and an expert, and, I've even got in that financial arena experts on self managed super funds, on wealth creation. So, we even drill down into what specifically do we need to explore more in terms of your financial situation to make sure that we've covered off all of the tax implications, and so that you're not going to find yourself worse off by accepting a payment, because there's strategies around that. There's obviously, everyone thinks let's tick the box and receive a lump sum payment, but I'm very mindful of referring and recommending my clients to just have a chat with a financial planner before we sign off anything and send it back to the fund, because there are other ways to accept payments like withdrawals and recontributions, income streams, and there's just ways around that. And I guess, again, if you haven't been exposed to this before, the superannuation fund isn't going to sit there and coach you on how you may or may not wish to receive a payment. That's not their mandate. It's about understanding that there are other complexities and considerations as a beneficiary, and then as the executor, what do your responsibilities look like in terms of tax compliance? If you don't understand all of that, and there is potentially a tax file number needed for the estate, you may need to engage a tax professional to help you through that process, because the buck stops with you as the executor. And that's where I'm really passionate about connecting people with experts to lead them on that journey in the right way.
Because there is that legal responsibility once you accept that role as executor, isn't there?
Absolutely. And even in some states, there's a legislation requirement that you need to publish a notice to creditors, where creditors are given 30 days to make claim on an estate. And then there's also, in some states, a requirement to publish a notice of intent to distribute. So that gives potential claimants 6 months in some case to make a claim on the estate. So as an executor, if you distribute all the assets before all of the liabilities are taken into account, or before you've given ample time for potential claimants to make a claim, you are responsible for that. You need to basically pay that money back. So again, state by state is different. And so getting you in touch with a lawyer that specialises in wills and estates and probate is super important, because they'll again lead you on that journey, make sure that you don't end up negligent or liable.
And how does someone get in contact with you?
So I am available basically via email, phone call. I think you've got the website,
Yeah, it'll
Catherine, as
definitely be in the
well.
show notes, and it's
Yeah.
on our Connect page as well.
Yeah, so just pick up the phone or flick me an email. And I think just the first most important step is we just have a no obligation chat about the estate and the position that you're in. Obviously, as I said, Catherine, your checklist is gold, because if anyone has worked through that checklist, by the time they get to me to do the checklist, there's everything that I could possibly need to run with and make those notifications. And we're not going to be digging for account numbers and passwords and legacies. It's kind of all there laid out. There's no breadcrumbs that we need to follow. It's a very clear and simple plan designed to make the process of dealing with after death administration more palatable, because it's not easy, but it's about, I guess, removing as much of that workload as possible so that we can really primarily focus on the processing of grief and healing.
And based on your own personal experience and having gone through it, and then, helping people go through it now, what has been the benefit for you out of this process? When you look back and you reflect, what are the things that you think, oh man, I wish I'd known that?
Well, I might answer that in two ways. The first way I wanted to answer that was, having gone through all of that grief and trauma has evolved my life, my perception on things and what's important. And firstly, what I find so rewarding is the feedback that I get from my clients around lightening the load, seeing the end of the tunnel, feeling relieved, feeling held, feeling guided, and feeling understood, and feeling all those things that I didn't get to feel when I was in that position. So that's been the most rewarding part for me. And I think what not only is, I suppose, my business a very new and unique concept, not many people have heard of it because it hasn't existed before. It's uncharted territory. But not only that, it's about, I guess, me turning that pain into something that can help people more easily navigate the process that I didn't have the opportunity to navigate. So it's really important for me that executors and families understand that they do have help, they do have support. There is help out there now, and they don't have to do it alone, and there is an easier way to do it. So that would be probably the first part of the question. And then I guess just like the tips and tricks for me were really around a lot of the financial piece of being a beneficiary, and also, if you know that a loved one is going to pass away, it's having conversations with a financial planner, because as we know, we have to pay tax as a beneficiary on a super benefit. But if that money can be withdrawn and put into another account, it can be exempt from taxes. So it's really, I guess, good to know that there are a lot of great people out there that will be in your corner to help you understand all of the considerations and implications, so that you don't find yourself 12 or 18 months down the track in a financial position that's worse off. So I think for me, so many of the things I've learned have been around legal ramifications, financial ramifications. And so, there's some of the things that we talk through in the consultation as well. So before you tick and flick, how's that going to affect you? So be the key things that I'm grateful to have learned, and things that I want to pay forward to people too.
And when you think back at that time when your dad died and then shortly thereafter your mum, was there anything prepared for you?
Yeah, they were really organised actually. They had folders and files, and we did have conversations because of mum's neurological disorder. And so there was a lot of documentation, very well organised and prepared, with account details and passwords. So that definitely made it a lot easier for me. And if I could encourage anyone listening to this call to have those conversations and to download Catherine's checklist, because, some people have that mindset, or once I'm gone, it doesn't matter, I don't need to deal with it. Your family need to deal with it, and your executor needs to deal with it. And it is really challenging. So the biggest gift you can give them is the opportunity to plan and prepare. So fortunately for me, my parents were very open in conversation, and I was their executor and power of attorney, and we did talk through all of the financial implications. So if I could say anything, it's start having those open conversations and reach out if there's any questions that you have to myself or Catherine, because there's the pre-planning specialty in Catherine's arena, and then I'm the after administration specialty. So together we can probably answer any of the questions or concerns that you have. And if we can't, we've got really great connections that can.
That's very true. You were fortunate, I suppose, to some degree that you had that information. I'd hate to see what it would have been like if you didn't have that information, So, but it's so great, the service that you offer, that you could help navigate that whole space, because it's such a difficult thing to do when you're grieving. So thank you so much, Danielle.
Thanks, Catherine.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.